Coronavirus can try to kill soccer in the physical world, but it can't kill soccer in my brain. This is the ethos that I'm going with into this video. Now, one thing that's universal in most parts of the world is a general love for soccer. Even if another sport is more popular in a certain country, soccer usually has a significant presence. One thing professional soccer relies on is national borders. However, many clubs that exist today have plied their trade in leagues in countries that no longer exist, or at least no longer exist in the same form. Something that fascinates me is what exactly a league was like in a country that is no longer around. What were the best teams? What was the dynamics of that league? The rivalries, controversies, complexities, strengths, weaknesses? I want to look at what exactly soccer was like in countries that are no longer around, or whose borders have changed significantly since their domestic leagues started. I have a kind of cutoff point. I won't be talking about countries that dissolved in the early 20th century because professional soccer is a historically new institution. So a country that ended in like 1930 wouldn't have a whole lot to discuss by that point. Most of these places will be former communist states from the good old Cold War times, but it doesn't have to be exclusively. Places like Sudan and Czechoslovakia can be involved if I find the information. So with the introduction out of the way, I'd like to welcome you to Football in the Former. Today I want to start with arguably the most well-known former nation from recent historical memory, the Soviet Union. Now, Russia is huge and cold, and I'm pretty sure hockey is number one. But soccer is also huge, and gives hockey a run for its money. Eastern Europe is well known for its feverish love of soccer to the point of hooliganism, at least according to the stereotypes. Russian teams generally perform pretty well in international competition. Not world beaters, but pretty good. Majority of the rest of the Soviet Union hasn't fared super well since the split, maybe for the exception of Ukraine and Poland, who have managed to carve out a middle-of-the-way presence in UEFA competitions. But for all these middling Eastern European leagues, there was a time when they were all together, playing under the same umbrella. The Soviet Top League is what I want to talk about today. It ran for 54 seasons, from 1936 to 1991. The league was apparently the brainchild of Nikolai Starosin, the head of the Spartak Sports Society in Moscow. To celebrate the league's founding, a soccer game was actually played right in Red Square, with Stalin apparently in attendance, as a part of the physical culture parade that was common in the USSR around that time. Apparently, the Red Square game was performed by two sections of the Spartak team who scripted a 4-3 scoreline so as not to bore Stalin, who wasn't very fond of pro sports. The success of this event did aid the continuation of Soviet soccer, which would kick off in the spring of that year, which was contested by 7 clubs. Its format was that of a spring and autumn title, kind of like a lot of Latin American leagues today, and the first season of the Canadian Premier League today right here at home, for me, which actually recently announced it would scrap that idea. And that's exactly what the Top League did after the first season. Dynamo Moscow won the first season in the spring, and Spartak won it in the autumn. Mikhail Semichastny of Dynamo Moscow was the top scorer of the spring, and George Glazkov was the top scorer of the fall. Looking at the early winners and runners-up tally of the league, you'll notice 3 Moscow teams continuing to place near the top: Dynamo, CSKA, and Spartak. This will be a trend from the 30s until about the 70s in Soviet football. Dynamo, apparently founded before the revolution, was considered the club of the secret police. Spartak was supposedly formed as a response to the state-owned sports clubs in the area, as it was formed by unions and was thus considered the club of the people. And CSKA, the oldest club in Russia, founded in 1911, was the club of the army. Clearly, these 3 teams, representing the state, army, and people of the Soviet capital, had the most resources and talent to draw from early on, because they were mostly engaged in a 3-way war for dominance during the league's early era. After the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the league, Dynamo had 11 titles, Spartak had 12, and CSKA had 7. Other industries actually had teams. In Moscow, for example, Lokomotiv represented the railway industry, and Torpedo the automotive industry. Clubs associated with apparatuses of state power were funded immensely, apparently, so ones associated with the army and police could draw on more resources, as the resources were essentially that of the state. This is a partial reason those clubs were so successful for so long during the life of the Soviet League. A notable exception to this seemed to be Spartak Moscow, who actually maintained themselves in more conventional ways. Players were paid in the Soviet League, as they would be employees of the specific organization that associated with their club. So if you sign with an army club, you're technically receiving army wages. If you're with a secret police club, you receive secret police wages, etc., etc. This was seemingly the trend across the USSR as to the founding and maintenance of teams. However, there was one team that actually won more titles than the big three Moscow clubs, and that was one created as the club of the army branch in Kiev, Dynamo Kiev. Of course, we have to remember that the USSR's league was not all Russian. The various Soviet republics all had representatives in this league, and Dynamo Kiev was the beacon of excellence for the republics. They won 13 Soviet League titles, as they stayed consistently excellent from the 60s to the early 90s. They didn't win their first title until 1961, but that first title opened the floodgates for the club, and Kiev quickly overtook the Muscovite Giants to be the USSR's best team. A few other notables in this list of winners of the league include Dynamo Tbilisi, who won 2 titles in 1964 and 1978 respectively. Keep in mind, this team has won nearly every iteration of the Georgian League since its inception. Zenit St. Petersburg, then known as Zenit Leningrad, won a title in 1984, so they did have silverware before their big money in recent times. Dynamo Minsk of Belarus captured one in 1982, and Ararat Yerevan of Armenia also have a title from 1973. Another few tidbits of interesting info about league winners and participants. Lokomotiv Moscow, who've won 3 Russian Premier League titles since the split of the Soviet Union, never won the Soviet top league, only having a runner-up to their name. All the republics to never have a top 3 finish include Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Moldavia, Tajikistan, and Estonia. Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan never had any teams appear in the top flight. So it can be argued that the teams within the republics mentioned just now, and Lokomotiv Moscow, may have actually benefited from the split of the USSR's league because the playing field has been shrunk and more opportunities to win titles have arisen for the teams in these places. There were 3 consistent tiers in Soviet football. They would come to be known as the top, first, and second league. The first 2 teams promoted to the top flight were Dynamo Tbilisi and Serp-i-Malat Moscow, who changed their name to Metallurg Moscow. The first 2 teams promoted from Division 3 to the second division were FC Dynamo Rostov and Dynamo Kazan. Weirdly enough, in the first season of top flight football, CSKA Moscow was actually relegated in last place. They apparently played about 2 games in the second division the next season before the Federation decided to bring them back. I wonder why. CSKA actually got last again in 1937, but there was no relegation plan for that season because 1938 saw a massive expansion of the first division. 17 whole new spots were added in the top league for the 1938 season, but with a whopping 12 relegation spots, 15th to 26th all got relegated. So since CSKA's relegation was essentially scratched from the record, the first team to get relegated and stay relegated was Burevestnik Moscow, who finished bottom of the 26-team Soviet top league that season in 1938. The next season saw only 14 teams in the top flight, and 2 clubs relegated, Electric Leningrad and Dynamo Odessa. One of the most interesting things about the Soviet football pyramid is how often it changed. In an article by Alexei Zakharov of Russian Football News, he outlined just how often the league changed structure and format. There are only a handful of seasons in which the format or amount of teams didn't change. As for the Soviet Cup, the first team to take it home was actually Lokomotiv Moscow, so they at least won something in the pre-Premier League era. They defeated Dynamo Tbilisi 2-0 in the final. A few other notable winners include the Armenian team Ararat Yerevan, who took 2 of them in 1973 and 1975, modern-day Zenit St. Petersburg in 1944, and a familiar face in the world of football today, Shakhtar Donetsk, who were known as Shakhtar Stalino for 2 of the 4 seasons in which they lifted the cup. And Ukrainian side Dnipro, who are most well known for reaching a Europa League final in 2015, actually lifted a cup title in 1989, alongside the league titles they won in 83 and 88. There were 2 seasons in which the cup straight up didn't happen, 1956 and 59. Finally, the last ever cup winners were CSKA in 1991. Rivalry dynamics in the Soviet League seem to follow a certain trend. Teams like Spartak Moscow generated a lot of heat as it faced off with police teams like Dynamo Moscow, and army teams like CSKA Moscow, and Dynamo Kiev. So you can imagine matches between state teams and teams sustained by unions or just normal fans were quite tense. Now, quoting a Spartak fan cited by the Football Grad podcast, the relationship of Spartak's fans to Dynamo was highly antagonistic. Dynamo represented the authorities, the police, the organs of state security. They hated privileged elites. They ate better, they dressed better, and they certainly didn't live in communal apartments. So you get the vibe that it was the status quo versus those living in it, the state apparatus versus the common man. Those dynamics undoubtedly brought the crowds, tension, and atmosphere to those Soviet football grounds. There was a specific incident in 1939 in which Spartak Moscow was ordered to play a rematch of their semifinal match with Dynamo Tbilisi, despite already winning the final of the Soviet Cup. Dynamo Tbilisi was the hometown team of the leader of the NKVD, Levante Beria. Spartak Moscow beat Tbilisi again, and apparently Beria threw a fit in the stands. The incidents didn't end there. During the Second World War, Spartak founder Nikolai Starosin was actually arrested and accused of being an enemy of the state, and a capitalist sympathizer for the way he ran his club. But Beria failed to get him executed. As far as the dynamics between Dynamo and CSKA went, they had an intense rivalry in the 40s and 50s. I reached out to Alexei Zakharov, the individual who wrote the tumultuous history of the Soviet League article mentioned earlier. He writes for Russian Football News and knows his stuff about both Russian and Soviet football history. He told me that while the rivalry was heated on the pitch, the relationship between the fans of the club was relatively amicable. I suppose it's no surprise considering they were the clubs of the police and the army. But that did not stop them from having battles on the pitch, as they continued to compete against each other. I also asked about the rise of Dynamo Kiev and the stagnation of CSKA and Dynamo Moscow from the 60s onwards. He told me that Dynamo Kiev may have had some powerful connections, and that there was even a popular saying. He said that match fixing was a pretty common occurrence in Soviet football as well. Not surprising, considering we've had match fixing scandals as recently as 2006 in Italy, 2011 in Turkey, and even here in Canada, there was a scandal over a semi-pro league with match fixing, which actually got that league's sanctioning removed. Ukraine definitely didn't have an easy time under Soviet rule, but their football teams thrived in the Soviet top league. Alongside Dynamo Kiev, Dnipro and Zorya won titles as well, so it seems those in power within Ukraine at least had a say in the football. As for some of the old powerhouses petering out, he mentioned that their form situation was not aided by the new General Secretary's relative indifference to football. Leonid Brezhnev apparently liked hockey more. While Dynamo Moscow continued to at least have a presence in the soccer scene, even winning the European Cup Winners' Cup in the 70s, CSKA faded out of title conversations and only their hockey team dominated. Minus the 1970 season, which they actually won, and the final ever Soviet League season in 1991. As for European football, the first Soviet team to play on the continent was Dynamo Kiev. Andriy Biba scored the first Soviet goal in Europe in the Cup Winners' Cup, versus Northern Irish side Coleraine. Spartak and Torpedo Moscow debuted in 1966, and CSKA and Dynamo Moscow in 1971. The first ever Soviet winner of a continental competition was also Dynamo Kiev, who defeated Bulgarian side Ferencvaros 3-0 at St. Jakob Park in Switzerland. In 1981, Dynamo Tbilisi repeated this feat. They defeated East German side Karl Zeiss Jena 2-1 in Dusseldorf. Finally, in regards to fan culture, I reached out to Oleg Semenov, a graduate of the Spartak Football Academy who's regularly engaged in Spartak Moscow's fan culture and scene. He actually spoke at the World Football Exhibition in Xi'an in 2017. He told me that fan culture as we know it today really started to pick up steam in the early 1970s, as fans of Spartak took inspiration from the counterculture vibes in other parts of Europe. In the stands, beer was a regular feature at matches, but he told me that there weren't really any incidents of hooliganism until the turbulent period of the 90s as the Soviet Union broke up. Tickets to home matches were apparently pretty cheap, but you had to go get tickets on the day of the match. Away fan culture was present, and there were not any restrictions on movement within the USSR, but he told me that on average only about 25 or so fans could go to away matches in those times. And today, when there isn't a virus shutting our games down, there are now thousands of people traveling for matches all the time because the economic conditions are now much improved from the Soviet era. As for international travel, traditionally, only Komsomol members could get the passports to go abroad, and regular fans were only allowed to go abroad around 1988. Well, that was my brief overview of what the soccer scene was like in the former Soviet Union. I want to thank Alexei Zakharov and Oleg Semenov for taking the time to speak with me and share their knowledge. I want to thank every other writer that I've put in my bibliography in the description for their articles on Russian and Soviet soccer. So next up in our adventure of soccer leagues that are no more is the Yugoslav First League. Now, the Balkans, or former Yugoslavia, however you like to define this region, is a hotbed of soccer talent. A recent Ballon d'Or winner, a World Cup finalist, and many very good players across the world. Evidently this region loves soccer. Their clubs don't do so hot these days in European competition, but there was a time when these clubs were feared as some of the best opposition around. A lot of historic clubs today, like Dinamo Zagreb, Red Star Belgrade, Hajduk Split, and Partizan Belgrade, used to all play in the same league, the Yugoslav First League. This league ran for over 60 years, and represented the clubs in modern-day Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Slovenia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia. These days, all these places have their own, smaller leagues. The Yugoslav First League was serious business. They even have a Champions League winner in their ranks, Red Star Belgrade in 1991. Over 60 years of history awaits us in this journey through the history of the league. Welcome to Football in the Former. The Yugoslav First League technically got started in 1923 with a single round-robin tournament to determine the champion. Quite an interesting, unorthodox way to run a national league. Gdanski Zagreb were the first champions of Yugoslavia, defeating Bosnia's SASK in the finals. Interesting thing about these finalists, after the Second World War, Gdanski was disbanded by the communist authorities and Dinamo Zagreb adopted their colors in bad. SASK in 2000 merged with NK Nepredak. Technically, neither of these first two Yugoslav finalists actually exist anymore, but they still kinda do. The first ever top scorer was Dragan Jovanovic with 4 goals during the tournament. Actually, Mr. Jovanovic was top scorer for 3 seasons in a row, and he played for Yugoslavia Belgrade, or SK Yugoslavia. Red Star Belgrade was basically given all their stuff after the war, since the new Tito regime also disbanded SK Yugoslavia. Now you might be noticing a certain trend here. The government really likes killing soccer teams. We'll address this soon. In 1929, the league moved to a double round-robin format, and Hajduk Split were the first ever winners in that new format. So before the Second World War, Gdanski, soon to be Dinamo Zagreb, were the most successful club in Yugoslavia with 5 titles, with BSK, soon to be OFK Belgrade, right behind them with 4. So a lot of things changed after the Second World War. Basically, Tito forced the league to essentially reboot itself in a new form. A lot of clubs were dissolved forcefully after playing in Croatia's short-lived league while they were an access member. Therefore, many clubs got shut down, and new clubs formed in their ashes, or they renamed themselves and started over. So the first league campaign back was just a tad bit unorthodox. Basically, it was a Yugoslav World Cup. Yeah, there weren't even clubs involved. All the teams in the National League in the 1945 season were just representatives of all the major Yugoslav states. And Serbia won it after a 1-0 win in the final against the Army's team. Yes, if anyone wants to brag, technically as a separate nation, the Serbian national team actually has silverware. They won the Yugoslav League in 1945. The next season, back to normalcy, the newly formed Partizan Belgrade won the league in 1947. Partizan Belgrade is an interesting case, because technically the Army team that beat Serbia in 1945 actually continued in the form of Army officers and veterans, creating Partizan Belgrade. And they technically got their revenge and won the title back the next season. Red Star Belgrade, basically Belgrade's club of the people in contrast to Partizan, would go on to battle for the title from this point forward and never really stopped being good. But Partizan were always a match. So basically the league from this point became a 4-way battle for dominance between Dinamo Zagreb, Hajduk Split, and Red Star and Partizan Belgrade. Interesting thing about Hajduk Split, they were one of the only pre-war teams left alone because they actually refused to play under Italian occupation during the war. So Tito spared them a dissolving and allowed them into the new league. While that 4-way battle was happening, there were a few other winners. Serbians Vojvodina won it a couple of times. Bosnian clubs Zalechnikar and FK Sarajevo also got titles to their names. But the Yugoslav First League was kind of a 4-horse race for most of its history, with a few outsiders getting some titles here and there. Another notable club, though, is Velez Mostar, a Bosnian club who got a whole bunch of runner-up places and a few third-place finishes. Basically, they were always good, but never good enough. So, relegation was instituted in 1946, and the first club relegated in the 46-47 season was Slovenians Nafta Lendava. They received a whopping 6 points through the whole season, and that was their only season in the Yugoslav First Division. Despite this, they stuck around until as recently as 2012, when the club went bankrupt. And they've been succeeded by ND Lendava, who have since climbed back to the second division. FK Sarajevo was the first team promoted in 1947. The first cup champions were HASK Zagreb, a club that was also dissolved in 1945, and no attempt to rebuild it was made until after the breakup of Yugoslavia. The last cup winners, excluding 1992, which saw a lot of clubs leave as Yugoslavia broke up in the middle of the tournament, were Hajduk Split in 1991. The last league winners were Red Star Belgrade in 1991. Well, the rivalries in the Balkans are a little more well known than in the former Soviet Union. We got a few major ones here. Partizan Belgrade versus Red Star, Dinamo Zagreb versus Hajduk Split, and even SK Sarajevo versus Selečnikar Sarajevo. I want to briefly touch upon the Zagreb Split rivalry. Hajduk Split has been running with a particular anti-fascist grain since it rejected playing in Mussolini's league in the 1940s. It's seen as the club of the people, but Zagreb, in contrast, does not have an authoritative character, like in the rivalry between Red Star and Partizan. Zagreb's predecessor club, Gdanski, was created as a club representing Croatia's identity, so there may have been a nationalist ethos in the creation of the club, but at the same time, Hajduk's refusal to play in Italy is also nationalist in its own way, so pointing fingers at Zagreb is not something I'm going to do here. I think this rivalry just grew out of being Croatia's two most successful teams, both before and after independence, although Zagreb has taken a commanding lead in the rivalry since independence. So it's a very interesting rivalry, and there are no clearly defined lines like a lot of other historical rivalries. SK Sarajevo and Selečnikar is another interesting case. While the lines are a lot more blurred today, at least according to Wikipedia from what I could find, SK Sarajevo was a club backed by many ethnic Bosniaks, while Selečnikar was a lot more multicultural. In a Copa 90 video on the derby, most fans interviewed claim that the communities of both clubs came together during the Yugoslav war, and that many families are split between support of both clubs. So I don't know how much of this old ethnic ethos still survives. Now, all these rivalries continue to this day, but as far as I can find for cross-modern border matches, any matches between Hajduk, Dynamo, Partizan, and Red Star were definitely huge. As those teams were part of the Big Four of the league, think of more modern history when the Premier League's Big Four would face off. Arsenal, Man United, Chelsea, and Liverpool. Any matches between those four in the late 2000s and early 2010s were always exciting. Basically, the Yugoslav League seemed like it was like that the whole time, and even better since all four teams remained competitive. As for some European honors, we have a few in various competitions. Now, the first club to play in the Champions League was Partizan Belgrade in the inaugural tournament of the 55-56 season. They defeated Sporting Club of Portugal 8-5 on aggregate in the first match, before being eliminated by Real Madrid 4-3 on aggregate in the next. The first Yugoslav teams to play in the Europa League were Dinamo Zagreb, OFK Belgrade, and Selečnikar. Zagreb eliminated Bulgarian side Botev Vratsa 8-2 on aggregate. OFK Belgrade eliminated Djurgården 6-3 on aggregate, and Selečnikar eliminated Club Brugge 4-3 on aggregate. Dinamo Zagreb was technically the first Yugoslav team to win a title in Europe, winning the Intercity Fairs Cup in 1967. Yugoslavia has a few winners of the Intertoto Cup. The Intertoto Cup was somewhat like a friendly competition of clubs that didn't qualify for main European competitions. So Vojvodina has one, NK Čelik has one, Sloboda Tuzla has one, and Budućnost has one. The big kahuna here, though, is Red Star Belgrade's 1991 Champions League victory. They eliminated Switzerland's Grasshopper, Scotland's Rangers, Germany's Dynamo Dresden, and the mighty Bayern Munich on their way to the finals. In the finals, they defeated Marseille on penalties in Bari, Italy. Now, another thing I want to look at is how teams have benefited or not benefited from the breakup of the Yugoslav First League. Let's take it nation by nation. The first, starting from the most northerly point, is the best team in Slovenia, NK Maribor, with a whopping 15 titles in the Slovenian league since independence. For all the success in the modern Slovenian era, NK Maribor was founded in 1960 and never once won a top-flight title in unified Yugoslavia. In Croatia, that one is pretty obvious. Dinamo Zagreb have won nearly every iteration of the modern Croatian league, and in unified Yugoslavia, they won 9 titles. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, Selečnikar, who won a few Yugoslav titles, and Zrinjski Mostar are tied at the top. Zrinjski is from a medium-sized city called Mostar in the Herzegovinian half of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They won literally nothing in the Yugoslav days, but the club burst onto the scenes in the modern Bosnia-Herzegovina league and is tied with traditional powerhouse of the nation, Selečnikar, for titles. However, in the defense of Zrinjski, the club was banned from 1945 to 1992, thanks to you-know-who. So they didn't get many chances to win anything, In Serbia, while the Yugoslav League was Red Star Belgrade's playground, in modern Serbia, not so much. Partizan Belgrade actually has more titles in the modern era, with 8. Down in Montenegro, Sudjetska reigned supreme with 4 titles. Keep in mind this league only started in 2006, so Sudjetska's success is pretty impressive, especially since their first title actually took a while, as they won the first one only in 2013. They only debuted in the Yugoslav First League in 1964, and they didn't win anything during the Yugoslav days. In Kosovo, FC Pristina is on top with 10 titles. They debuted in the Yugoslav First League in 1983, and also didn't win anything during those times. Finally, in Macedonia, Vardar are the kings, with 10 titles. They never won a Yugoslav League title, but they did win a cup in 1961, defeating Partizan Belgrade on the way to the final, in which they defeated Croatians Varteks in the final 2-1 in Belgrade. Well, that's about as much information as I got for you guys. That's my video, so thank you everyone for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. If anyone's watching this, please let me know in the comments what other leagues you might want to see. Like, what former leagues are you interested in hearing about, and I'll try my best to find some information. This one was a little more just straight up informational than the other one, because I couldn't really find anyone that could help me with discovering fan culture from the Yugoslav days. So if anyone has something cool about that and is watching this, please let me know. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and take care.